In the early 20th century, the British Empire stretched across nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. It was the largest empire in history, controlling territories on every inhabited continent. The size, as events would demonstrate, did not guarantee stability. Between the two world wars, a series of administrative decisions regarding imperial defense would prove extraordinarily costly, not in dramatic battles, but through gradual erosion of resources and strategic position. The mistake began not with a single policy, but with a persistent assumption. British planners believed the empire could be defended through naval supremacy and a network of fortified bases. This had worked for generations. The strategy relied on the Royal Navy's ability to move forces quickly between theaters, responding to threats as they emerged. It seemed logical. It had historical precedent. And it allowed Britain to maintain global commitments without maintaining massive standing armies in every territory. But the world was changing faster than the strategy adapted. During the 1920s and 30s, military technology evolved rapidly. Aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and submarine warfare transformed naval operations. The distances that once protected British territories became vulnerabilities. Yet the commitment to far-flung possessions continued to grow. Even as the means to defend them became increasingly strained, the Singapore Naval Base illustrates the problem clearly. Construction began in 1923 and continued for 15 years. The facility was designed to serve as the cornerstone of British defense in Asia, a supposedly impregnable fortress that would deter any aggression in the region. The project consumed enormous resources. Historians estimate the cost exceeded £60 million. It's an astronomical sum equivalent to billions in today's currency. The base was built on specific assumptions about how a future conflict would unfold. Planners expected any threat to come from the sea. The fortifications faced the water. The heavy guns were positioned to engage naval vessels. Jungle to the north was considered impassable to large military forces. Records indicate that multiple engineers and military advisors questioned these assumptions during the construction phase. Their concerns were noted but not acted upon. The facility opened in 1938, already outdated in important respects. Within 4 years, Japanese forces approached from the north through the supposedly impassable terrain. The defenses faced the wrong direction. The base fell in February 1942, and with it, British prestige throughout Asia suffered irreparable damage. The loss was not primarily military, it was symbolic and economic. Decades of investment, both financial and political, collapsed in weeks, but Singapore was only the most visible example of a broader pattern. Throughout the empire, similar miscalculations were occurring. In the Middle East, Britain maintained costly mandates in Iraq and Palestine, commitments that required military garrisons and administrative staff. The expenses mounted steadily. The economic return diminished, yet withdrawal seemed politically impossible, and so the expenditures continued. In India, the jewel of the empire, administrative costs had been rising for decades. The Indian civil service expanded continuously. Infrastructure projects demanded investment. Meanwhile, the economic benefit to Britain was declining as Indian industries developed and trade patterns shifted. By the 1930s, evidence points to India costing more to administer than it contributed to British wealth. The empire had become, in economic terms, a net liability. This reality was obscured by accounting methods that distributed costs unevenly and by political rhetoric that emphasized prestige over profit. Few politicians were willing to acknowledge publicly that the empire might be economically unsustainable. The institutional momentum was too strong, the emotional investment too deep, so decisions that might have reduced commitments were repeatedly postponed. The financial strain became acute during the Second World War. Britain borrowed extensively, primarily from the United States, to fund the war effort and maintain its global position. By 1945, the national debt had increased sixfold. The country was essentially bankrupt. American loans came with conditions, including pressure to dismantle trade preferences that had favored imperial territory.
The winds of change
the post-war years, forced a
signaling the
reckoning.
dramatic end of
Britain
empire.
simply could not afford to
The
maintain
transition
the
from
administrative
colonial
and
rule to
military
self-governance
infrastructure
was
the
rarely
empire
smooth,
required.
marked by
India
both
gained
celebration
independence in
and intense
1947.
deliberation.
Palestine was abandoned in 1948. 2 decades, most other territories followed. The empire that had taken centuries to build dissolved in less than a generation. Historians suggest the cost of this extended imperial overreach can be measured in several ways. There were the direct financial losses, the wasted investments in facilities like Singapore that never fulfilled their intended purpose. There were the opportunity costs, the resources that might have been invested in domestic industry or social programs, but instead went to distant garrisons and administrative offices. And there were the strategic costs, the weakening of Britain's position relative to rising powers like the United States and Soviet Union. Perhaps most significant were the delayed costs, consequences that only became apparent over time. The rapid decolonization, forced by economic necessity rather than planned transition, left many former territories poorly prepared for independence. The resulting instability in regions from Africa to Asia created problems that persisted for decades. Britain's own economic difficulties in the post-war period, often attributed to industrial decline, were partly rooted in the misallocation of resources during the imperial twilight. The mistake was not imperialism itself, which had its own complex history and consequences. The mistake was continuing to expand commitments and maintain expensive infrastructure long after the economic and strategic logic had shifted. It was assuming that past success guaranteed future viability. It was prioritizing symbolic prestige over practical sustainability. No single decision caused this outcome. No individual bears sole responsibility. The error was systemic, built into institutions that rewarded expansion and penalized retreat. It was cultural, embedded in assumptions about Britain's role in the world that were slow to adapt to changing circumstances. And it was gradual, unfolding over decades in ways that made each individual choice seem reasonable at the time. The full scope of what had been lost, both in treasure and in strategic position, became clear only after the process was complete. By then, the decisions that might have managed the transition more effectively had long since passed. What remained was the recognition that size alone had never been strength, and that the costs of maintaining an illusion can exceed the benefits of facing reality, however uncomfortable that might be.